January 1943. A prison cell in Saratov on the Volga. The man dying of starvation on the floor is Nikolai Vavilov, the Soviet botanist who built the first seed bank on Earth, the man whose life's work was to end famine. 800 miles away, at that exact moment, 9 of his scientists are starving too, locked inside a vault full of food they have sworn not to eat. You have eaten something today that came out of that vault. Not the same grain, the descendants of it. The bread, the rice, the corn on your plate this week almost certainly traces back through a chain of seeds to a collection Nikolai Vavilov spent his life gathering. 250,000 samples of every crop humanity grows, pulled out of 64 countries, stored in a single building in Leningrad. The man who fed the future was starved to death by his own government, and the scientists he left behind made a choice no one in history had asked of anyone. What you are about to learn is something almost no one in the West is taught. The story of the man who built the world's defense against famine and was destroyed by the regime he built it for. He was beaten by a charlatan whose science failed in the fields and won in the ministries. He was interrogated for nearly 1,700 hours, and while he was dying of hunger in a Soviet prison in a besieged city 800 miles north, 9 of his colleagues chose to die guarding food they could have eaten. We are going to look at exactly why. Nikolai Ivanovich Vavilov was born in Moscow in 1887, the son of a merchant. He trained at the Petrovsky Agricultural Academy and then in England, at the John Innes Center, under the geneticist William Bateson, the man who coined the word genetics. Vavilov returned to Russia with a single enormous question. Famine in the country he had grown up in was a recurring catastrophe. He wanted to know whether a state could be made famine-proof. By 1921, he was running the institute in Leningrad that would, over the next 2 decades, attempt to answer that question. The method was simple. A blight wipes out the potato, so you reach into a drawer in a Leningrad basement and pull a wild Andean tuber that survived it. A drought kills the wheat. You pull a hardier strain Vavilov carried home from the highlands of Ethiopia. 1 volt, every crop humanity grows, every wild relative of every crop. So he went and got them, to Afghanistan, to Ethiopia, to Peru, to Persia. The vault that 9 of his colleagues would later starve to save. He brought back the wild ancestors of the apple from Afghanistan, the forgotten small-grained cereals of Ethiopia, the original potato from the Andes. And along the way, he did something else. He drew a map. He proposed that all of humanity's food crops had originated in a small number of regions, what he called the centers of origin. That map is still in every plant genetics textbook. By 1940, the vault he had built in Leningrad held more than 200,000 distinct samples. There was nothing like it anywhere else on Earth. At the same time, inside Soviet agriculture, a different kind of man was rising. Trofim Lysenko was a peasant agronomist with no formal training in genetics. He had a doctrine he called vernalization. Soak winter wheat in cold water, he said, and not only would that wheat survive the cold, its offspring would inherit the toughness. Generation after generation, the seed would be permanently transformed by what had happened to its parent. This was not how Mendelian genetics worked. It contradicted everything the field had established. But it offered Joseph Stalin, whose collective farms were failing, a science he preferred. A peasant science, ideologically compatible, promising miracle yields without the inconvenience of Mendel and the bourgeois Western journals. Lysenko had Stalin. None of it mattered. On the 6th of August, 1940, on a plant-collecting expedition in the Carpathians, Nikolai Vavilov was arrested by the NKVD. He had defended Mendel for a decade, debated Lysenko in lecture halls, in journals, on the side of 2 decades of international evidence. He was by then the head of the institute, a member of the Academy of Sciences, the man the Soviet Union had sent to every major plant science congress in the world. The Soviet prosecution file on Vavilov has been preserved, and the numbers in it are difficult to read. Across the months that followed, he was interrogated in approximately 400 sessions. Some of those sessions lasted 13 hours. The total, according to records released later, was roughly 1,700 hours of interrogation. He was charged with sabotage, with spying for Britain. with belonging to a counter-revolutionary organization that did not exist. On the 9th of July, 1941, a week after the Wehrmacht crossed into the Soviet Union, Nikolai Vavilov was sentenced to death. The sentence was later commuted to 20 years in prison. 2 months after that sentence, in September of 1941, the German army closed its ring around Leningrad. The siege would last 872 days. By the end of the first winter, more than 500,000 civilians in the city were dead of starvation, of cold, of artillery. People were eating wallpaper paste, leather, in some accounts each other. And inside the besieged city, on St. Isaac's Square, in the institute Vavilov had built, sat the vault. 250,000 samples of edible seed. A limited evacuation was attempted, but the last rail line out of the city closed before the collection could be moved. So 9 scientists at the institute did the only thing they could think to do. They moved the most vulnerable seeds, tubers, and roots into the basement rooms of the building. They organized rotating night watches against rats, and in the cold and the dark, surrounded by tons of food that could have kept them alive, they began to starve. Aleksandr Stchukin, the keeper of the groundnuts, died at his desk. Dmitri Ivanov, the keeper of the rice, died in a room stacked with sacks of edible rice he refused to open. 7 others died alongside them. Not one of the samples they were guarding was eaten. The collection survived the winter intact. They had a reason. The reason was the future. If the war was lost, if the city fell, if the regime fell, the only thing the rest of the world might have to rebuild the agriculture of a destroyed country was that vault. Eating it would feed them for a few weeks. Preserving it could, in principle, feed a continent for centuries. They decided the vault outweighed their own lives. There is no other way to describe what they did. It was a sentence they passed on themselves, in the dark, with no one in power asking them to. 800 miles south, Nikolai Vavilov did not know any of this. He had been transferred from the Lubyanka in Moscow to a prison in Saratov on the Volga in the autumn of 1941. By January of 1943, what he was being fed was mashed frozen cabbage and moldy flour, not enough to live on. On the 26th of January 1943, the man whose life's work had been to make famine impossible died of starvation in his cell. He was 55 years old. He was never told what his colleagues in Leningrad had chosen to do. Lysenko, in the years that followed, reached the summit of his power. In August of 1948, at a session of the Soviet Academy of Agricultural Sciences, Mendelian genetics was formally denounced and effectively banned in the Soviet Union. Geneticists across the country were dismissed from their posts, sent into exile, in some cases jailed. The institute Vavilov had built was purged. Lysenko's doctrines were taught in every Soviet biology classroom for the next 15 years. While the harvests they were supposed to triple kept failing, Soviet agriculture, in the period Lysenkoism dominated it, fell catastrophically behind every other major producer in the world. The reversal came slowly. Joseph Stalin died in 1953. 2 years later, in 1955, Nikolai Vavilov was posthumously rehabilitated by the Soviet government. Through the 1960s, as the evidence accumulated, Lysenko's influence collapsed. Mendelian genetics was restored to Soviet biology. The institute in Leningrad, now St. Petersburg, was renamed the N.I. Vavilov All-Russian Institute of Plant Genetic Resources. It is still standing. The collection his 9 colleagues died for is still in those vaults, and the legacy reaches farther than that. The model Vavilov built, a centralized bank of crop genetic diversity, drawn from the centers of origin he mapped, stored against the possibility of catastrophe, became the template for every major seed bank on Earth, from the United States National Plant Germplasm System to the Svalbard Global Seed Vault buried under the Norwegian Arctic. Most of what is grown on this continent today, the corn, the wheat, the soybean, the potato lines in the school cafeteria, descends in part from collections traceable to the bank Vavilov built and the global network it inspired. You ate something today that came out of that vault. The man who built it was starved to death by his government. 9 of his colleagues starved themselves to save it. Their names are on a small plaque in St. Petersburg. Most of the people whose lives that vault has fed will never know they existed. He spent his life trying to end famine. He was killed by it. They watched him die from 800 miles away, and they decided in the dark that what he had built was worth more than what they could have eaten. It still is. Case files on the people history forgot to thank. New cases every week.